Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello and welcome back to Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. Lots of things on the agenda this time around. Talking with Genevieve Graham, based somewhere in Nova Scotia, who writes, we'll call them historical fiction with a little bit of romance thrown in, lots of wartime stuff. Genevieve Graham, how are things in Nova Scotia these days?
It's beautiful out here, and it's definitely spring. We've had a really good... compared to everybody else, we've had a pretty good time of it with the whole COVID lockdown. Nova Scotia has done very well.
That's good, and I've been looking at your chart of all the books you've written, and there's more than one or two. They all look fascinating. The ones we're going to talk about today, Letters Across the Sea and The Forgotten Home Child. But I understand earlier in your life you wanted to be a professional oboe player. So tell me about that.
I did. I grew up loving classical music, and then I went to the University of Toronto and got my Bachelor of Music in Performance on the oboe, and my dream was to be principal oboe at the Montreal Symphony someday. But things change. I ended up going an entirely different direction. I went into advertising and promotion. I still use my classical music because I taught piano to dozens of neighborhood kids for a few years. And I ended up, I worked in advertising, promotion, fundraising, all those things for about 10 years, I think, before I became a stay-at-home mom. And then the way I got into writing so relatively late in life was that I was in my 40s and taking care of two small, beautiful, busy daughters. And I guess I sort of forgot what it was like to take care of myself instead of everybody else in the house. And my mom gave me a copy of Outlander and said, it's time to get back to something that you have always loved. And I got back into reading.
And where was your early life before we get into the books that are out there today? Where'd you start out in life and go to school, stuff like that?
I grew up in Toronto. I went to North Toronto Collegiate, and I ended up at University of Toronto. I actually moved to, in 1992, I went on a ski vacation out to Banff, and I was in the chairlift lineup when I met a tall, handsome young man who has now been my husband for the last 28 years. And I moved to Calgary, where we lived for 18 years. And then in 2008, we moved to Nova Scotia, and we've been here ever since.
And it's wonderful there. I've been there once, but it was a great time. Toured around and didn't know. I was living in the States at that time, so this was the first lengthy trip in Canada. I kept forgetting that the kilometers were up there instead of miles. So something would say 100 kilometers to Digby, and I'd be there in like an hour. And I go, what? How the heck did that happen? So when did you actually start writing professionally then?
It was 2007 when I first started writing, but my first book came out in 2012.
2007, 2012. The book, what was the first book?
Well, I wrote 3 books. When I read that book that my mom gave me, a copy of Outlander, I got back in historical fiction, and I got a little bit obsessed with Scottish history, and I wrote 3 books based in Scotland in the 1700s. But the 3 of them were picked up by Penguin in New York, but they're no longer in print. But they came out in 2012 and 2013. And it was around 2008 when I moved to Nova Scotia that I realized that I wanted to change direction. I still wanted to write historical fiction, but I didn't want it to be around another country. I wanted it to be around my own. Nova Scotia is so full of incredible history that I knew nothing about. So that's when I decided that's what I have to focus on from now on.
So your motivation is historical novels with a decidedly Canadian slant or bent, which is something we have sorely lacked in this country for many years, I think.
Yes, exactly. That was my feeling. Is that I read tons of historical fiction, but they were basically set in, Scotland or England or the U.S. or something like that. And there's some beautiful Canadian books, but not a lot of, as they would call it, commercial fiction based on our history. And I didn't know why. And I think I grew up believing that Canadian history wasn't really all that interesting. And I learned about the War of 1812 and the Plains of Abraham, but basically I didn't remember much more than that. And I thought it was about time to change that.
I think most of us grew up that way, and we learned, the capitals of the United States and stuff like that, but nobody told us anything about the defense of Hong Kong in 1941 or going off to war in 1939 or anything else about us, like Western expansion, railroads, prejudices, things like that, bilingualism. No. It was all whatever John Wayne had to tell us, and that was about it. We're talking with Genevieve Graham right now. Now, I have two books in front of me, Genevieve. It's The Forgotten Home Child and, of course, Letters Across the Sea. So, I'd forgotten about this. I've kind of heard a bit about that. But we'll go back a bit. What were the home child or the home children we're talking about here?
Oh, the British home children. This was an amazing story that, when I remember learning a little bit about Canadian history. This, I think, is one thing that we should be taught. The story is between 1869 and 1948. Over 120,000 destitute children were sent from the streets and the orphanages and the workhouses of England and Scotland to Canada to work as indentured servants. And they were, approximately 75% of them were horribly neglected and abused and even killed while they were living here. And they felt so horrible about the way that they lived that most of them never told anybody the truth about who they were. And as a result, we know very little. But they've now determined that over 12% of Canadians are descended from the British home children, so over 4 million people, but very few of them have any idea of their ancestry.
And that's The Forgotten Home Child by Genevieve Graham. Now, that just came out just a while ago, right?
That came out last March 2020, 1 week before all the bookstores closed.
Oh, no. Now, I've noticed similarity between The Forgotten Home Child and Letters Across the Sea in that told from multiple points of view. Was that intentional, I assume, on your part?
Yes, I like to write from, I usually have a romantic element in the story because I think it's really important that we tie the history into emotional stories and connect the characters that way. So I usually have a male and a female, and they each have their own perspectives. The Forgotten Home Child also had the dual timeline. It had the past tense and nowadays. So that Letters Across the Sea also will have the male and the female speaking their own stories throughout.
So you're talking about war and love. So make love and war.
Yeah. The whole thing.
Yeah.
I feel like that as a historical fiction author, I have a responsibility to tell a story that not only teaches the mind, but touches the heart. Because when you remember history through emotional experiences, then you never forget it. It's like, I have a terrible analogy, but if you see a car crash, you remember it for a couple of days. But if you know somebody that's in that car crash, you're never going to forget it.
You never forget
it. And so I think, so
Yeah.
the whole idea of historical fiction is to make you really care about this history and not forget.
And I'm certain readers such as myself, will not forget the stories and Letters Across the Sea by Genevieve Graham and The Forgotten Home Child. Go out and buy them both right now. Excuse me as I burp. What was I going to say? How do you plot out your books? Because they're from different viewpoints. So do you write from one person's perspective first and then the other one? Or how does that work?
The stories sort of come to me organically as I write. I start with the research of the actual event and what I want to explore historically, and then the characters start to appear to me. So mostly, if I've got the characters that are appearing along the way, one of them will speak first, and then the next. It's just sort of they sort of grow from each other's experiences, but then most of the time I separate them for some reason. For example, in Letters Across the Sea, Max ends up going to World War II, and so we lose track of him for a little while. And so I follow through with her perspective for a ways.
And we're talking with Genevieve Graham here about Letters Across the Sea, her latest book, and The Forgotten Home Child that came out last year just before the plague struck. And I'm reading now about Molly and Max in Letters Across the Sea. And what we have is, you're talking about, let's see, for just a sec here. And we're discussing Max. He went to McMaster University because of a Jewish quota at the University of Toronto. So that must have been a true fact.
Yes, it was. There were quotas, and there were so many. There's so many facts about Toronto in that time period that just amazed me. Having grown up in Toronto, and I didn't know anything about the 1930s and how prevalent anti-Semitism was, how violent it was becoming. So when I started to research the Christie Pitts riot, which was the largest ethnic riot in Canadian history, from August 1933, I learned so much about where we came from that way, and a lot of things about stories about the people would have. It was during the Great Depression, but they would still sometimes have jobs, and they'd have window signs that said, "Help wanted, Jews need not apply," things like that. And swastika clubs, which were groups of boys that would basically go out and create trouble with the Jewish population. It was things I knew nothing about. It was fascinating to learn.
Now, there's a newspaper you mentioned, Der Jiddischer Journal, which I assume is the Yiddish Journal. Did you actually read copies of that?
I've read translated sections of it. I'm not Jewish, and I can't read any of it, but there were translated sections while I was doing my research.
And you also got one segment where it was a warm and steamy day in Toronto. Was that from memory, or do you actually go back and check weather forecasts from old newspapers?
I do. I go through the old newspaper articles, and you can find archives. If you dig deep enough online, it will tell you different days and what it was like.
I know I've been doing a lot of that. I'm researching a book on 1963, and so I subscribe to that newspaper service, and I look at the front page of a newspaper from 1963, and it's got everything we would ever need to know about what went on even up until press time earlier that day. It's quicker than the internet and much more detailed. As an aside, Genevieve, I think newspapers have dropped the ball here. They're not doing what they set out to do, and should have kept on doing. They're charging us more and giving us less, but that's beside the point. But yeah, it's great. I read Ottawa Citizen that came out at 5 p.m. It hit the streets, and it had court results from 2 o'clock that afternoon. So
oh wow,
that's quicker than the internet. And the internet,
that's amazing.
The internet, of course, is not always right. At least somebody has told me that once. So you started writing professionally in your 40s. So it says up here that proof that you're never too old to try something new. So you believe that, I assume.
Yes, you can teach old dogs new tricks, apparently.
Yeah, well, we can't teach our dog any tricks, but that's okay. Maybe we can teach our cats to stay at home. What inspired you, The Forgotten Home Child? We heard about that, but so you decided, this could be an interesting story. Then what kind of research did you have to do into that?
That was an amazing story, and I think that at the very beginning of it, the interesting part was that I really couldn't find much information, that nobody knew anything about it. And I thought, well, this is a story that needs, it's just crying out to be told. And when I did run across books, most of the ones I found were nonfiction. So I thought, okay, we're going to read all the nonfiction I can. I'm going to get into all the research. But what I did to with the research for this book that was so much fun and so rewarding was that I went to the British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association website, which directed me to their Facebook page where they have thousands of descendants of these home children. And all they want to do is teach about it. They want to educate the public, and they want to find information on their own ancestors. And so when I told them I wanted to write about these children, they were more than willing to help. I wrote up a survey. The first page was basically, name and what information they knew about when they might have arrived here and things like that. But the second page was asking things about their personality. What do you remember about them? What were you told about them? Was there anything that you can remember that's specific about them? And I thought, well, I might get a few responses. And as I sat by my email, I received over 200 responses within 1 week. And from all of that, I had the actual stories of so many children that I was able to work those actual events into characters and make the characters out of the real children. So everything that you read about in The Forgotten Home Child actually happened to a child along the way.
And this is just amazing, and we're talking with the amazing Genevieve Graham. Two main books we're talking about. The Forgotten Home Child came out last year. Well, of course, if you hear this 10 years from now, it'll be back then. And the recent one, Letters Across the Sea. Do you have a project you're working on now?
I always have a project going on. My goal is to write a book a year, so I am working on one right now. It's based on a bunch of different things, but mostly the spotlight is on rum running during Prohibition around Windsor Detroit Tunnel in there. It's a pretty fascinating time.
Oh, how the Brofmans made all their money and things like that. Sure, why not?
Yeah.
What is your daily routine like, if you don't mind us telling us? How do you structure your day?
Well, I'm lucky now because both of our daughters are fully grown, and they only come here once in a while to visit. So I'm not worrying like a lot of younger authors are about taking care of everybody, so that's nice. I have my office in our bedroom, and I'm basically up, and after breakfast I'm up here and writing pretty much all day. My husband will show up at 5 o'clock with a glass of wine and say, "You're done," and that's pretty much it.
So that is the routine. If people want to be writers, they have to write. That's pretty much it, right?
Exactly. There's so many people that have said to me, I wish I could write a book, or I have a story I'd like to tell. But then when I ask them why they don't, they're kind of, I don't think I have time or anything. But I believe that if you write for 5 or 10 minutes a day, you can actually change some of the neural paths in your brain somehow, and it gets easier and easier, and finding the time to write becomes a joy. I love doing it.
Well, people find time to watch, The Bachelorette, so
exactly.
Why can't they find time? And I am one of those. I've had writer's block for 30 years, and I went to a therapist talking about the same thing back in the mid-90s, and he said, write 10 or 15 minutes a day, or write one thing a day. Well, I didn't quite take his advice, but that's the thing. I mean, people say, I wish I had the time to write. Well, you do have the time. You just have to carve it out. That's
I think another reason that people stop is because they're afraid people will criticize or not be interested. And really, the answer to that is, who cares? Just write for yourself. And, if you aren't writing for the public, then that's just fine. You write for yourself and you see what comes of it eventually.
We're talking with Genevieve Graham. Letters Across the Sea is the most recent book from Genevieve. The Forgotten Home Child. Previous to that, what about At the Mountain's Edge? What's that one about?
Oh, that's my big adventure story. I wanted to read about the Mounties. The Mounties are the #1 most recognized symbol of Canada around the world. And I wanted to find out where their reputation came from, where their courage, their steadfastness, and I wanted to learn about the origins, but I didn't want to write a chronological story about them. So I had to find the right vehicle, and I just happened across an article once about the Klondike Gold Rush. And I didn't even realize that was a Canadian thing, which it almost wouldn't have been if not for the Mounties. And through that story, through finding out about how these men basically built an outpost in minus 60 degrees weather in blizzards that could bury their tent in hours, and working working for the purpose of keeping people safe, and how they basically saved about tens of thousands of lives through the rules that they imposed and enforced. It was everything I needed to show me who these men were back then and why they deserved the recognition. So yeah, at the mountain's edge is about the Northwest Mounted Police. Yes. And the Klondike Golden.
Right, and they didn't become the Royal for a long time. It was the Northwest Mounted Police. Yeah. And then it went from there. Tides of Honor. That looks like a World War I story.
It is. Tides of Honor was my first Canadian historical fiction. It's when I moved to Nova Scotia. As I mentioned, Nova Scotia is full of history. It's amazing to go into, to see all these abandoned homes along the highways that are from 150 years ago, or you go into a graveyard that has generations of families there, and you see all the history. And I started talking about this to people around here, and that's when I realized that how little I actually knew, because I had never heard of the Halifax explosion. Oh. And people were quite shocked, yes. Shocked and alarmed. But when I spoke to anybody west of here, a lot of them didn't know about it either. And I thought, well, this is the most important story, because, it was the largest man-made explosion in the world before Hiroshima, and yet we're forgetting about it, and that's not right. So I started to research it, and I started to research the eastern shore of Nova Scotia, where I lived for 10 years, and how they dealt with World War I, and it went through a lot of things, that book. It goes through, he meets a woman in France, and she introduces us to the suffragettes, and she works in a munitions factory. So I try to touch on a lot of different things in that book.
And that's Tides of Honor by our guest Genevieve Graham. Letters Across the Sea, The Forgotten Home Child at the Mountain's Edge. Tides of Honor, spelled the proper way, Honour. And,
of course.
And Come From Away sounds like something about Newfoundland.
Okay, it's not that story. I tell people you can sing and dance if you want while you're reading it, but it's not that story. Come From Away is actually it's a pretty cool story based on the same family that I wrote about in Tides of Honor. So again, it's set on the Eastern Shore, but it's during World War II. There's actually there's a true story of the U-boats were always coasting around the St. Lawrence and around the outsides on the shore, and they were spying on the traffic of our ships as they came and went. And there's a true story about, in 1942, there was a U-boat that was moored about 10 minutes away from where I was living at the time. And half a dozen German U-boat sailors actually got out of their boat and went to a community dance. And the locals still remember it. The locals say, oh yes, my great aunt danced with one of them or something. And I really had to look into a lot, because I found it very difficult to believe at first, but it is a true story. And then after that dance, nobody saw the men again. So I took the fact, the nonfiction part of that, and I fictionalized it by stranding one of them here. So it was basically Nova Scotia versus a stranded Nazi. So that one was fun too.
Well, they had a weather station they put up there that wasn't discovered till years later. So.
That's right. There's a lot of things here that they did in secret. There's a story about finding a Halifax movie theater ticket in a German wallet at some point. It's very interesting.
Right. And Genevieve Graham, Promises to Keep. Now that looks like the cover I'm looking at would be around your War of 1812 type era?
Even earlier than that. This is 1755.
Yes. Fort Louisbourg.
Yes, around that time, and this was the expulsion of the Acadians.
Oh yeah, because we're so nice in Canada, right? We're so nice.
That's right.
What a load of bullcrap that is. I hate that. We're the worst. Sorry.
That was a hard story to write, because the truth of it was so awful that I had to find a fictional story within it, because it's really so hard to believe that we treated ourselves, other people in the country, the way they did during the expulsion.
Well, it's like I always say to people, no, Canadians, by and large, I think we're some of the most prejudicial inward-looking, colonial, if you want to use that term, most ridiculous people in the face of the earth, and yet we tell everybody that we're so wonderful because we're better than Americans. Well, enough.
I don't think we're the worst people on earth. I think everybody makes mistakes.
Well, no, I'm just being sarcastic because that's what I do. Tips for somebody who wants to be a young person. What would you suggest to them?
If they want to be a writer, the first thing you need to do is read. You need to read and read and read and find out what you like and what you don't like. And then when you think you've got an idea in your head, just as we said, sit down and write 10 or 15 minutes a day if that's all you've got. But turn it into a habit and just keep writing. And write for yourself. Don't write for anybody else.
And how do you write a book? One word at a time. We're talking with Genevieve Graham, and I sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I can write maybe 1 page a week. So I think I'm looking at these 2 books. I'm going, these are really nice. They're written in a friendly, easy to absorb fashion without being simplistic. I think that maybe they should be part of every high school curriculum in the country.
That is my mission. Dennis. I would love to see these in the curriculum because yes, they're geared basically from grade 9 up.
Right.
And they're not, as you say, they're not simplistic, but they are easy to read. I never took a writing course in my life, so I write it as I see it and as I feel it. So I think that what it would do is exactly what I've been trying, is it would emotionally attach the kids in school and everyone above to our history, and you can't forget it after that. So, but it's hard to get a book into the curriculum. It's very hard.
Well, we should work on that. Yes, that's what I was thinking. That there's romance, but it's not mushy stuff. So guys can read these books and girls can read these. Like you got playing baseball, Letters Across the Sea. They're out at a ball game, and you kind of sounds like you know what you're talking about when it comes to baseball. So that's good. But yeah, it's talking about kids, poor people, rich people, stuff that goes on. Who's going to ask me to the dance almost, and yet then it goes on from there. Genevieve Graham, what's your next project? Or did I ask you that already?
After the rum running, who knows? I've been finding all sorts of new ideas, but the next one will be the Wilbur one and Spanish flu a little bit and into rum running.
And you have a website, I assume?
I do. It's www.genevievegraham.com.
And Genevieve is Genevieve Graham.
Exactly.
And you can even sign up for her newsletter. So.
Yes, and I'll be sending one out soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, and best of luck from now on.
Thanks so much, Dennis. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.